The year was 1927, and New York City pulsed with a frenetic energy, a glittering, audacious heartbeat that defied the very laws of gravity. Neon signs, still a novelty, bled emeralds and rubies onto wet asphalt, painting fleeting masterpieces for scurrying taxis and laughing couples. Below the elevated trains, which roared overhead like metallic dragons, streets hummed with ambition. Everyone, it seemed, was reaching for something: a fatter wallet, a louder laugh, a brighter spotlight. Eleanor Vance, barely 21, felt the city's magnetic pull deep in her bones. She wasn't born into this dizzying world of speakeasies and stock tips. She'd arrived 2 years ago from a dusty Iowa farm, clutching a worn suitcase and a single audacious dream: to sing. Not in some quiet church choir, but where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and possibility, where the music pulsed and defied the dying embers of prohibition. Tonight, the air in the Blue Note was a tangible thing, a blend of gin, sweat, and cheap perfume. Eleanor stood backstage, the velvet curtain heavy and scratchy against her bare arm. The jazz band, led by the charismatic, impossibly cool trumpeter Leo "Lucky" Thorne, was tearing through Sweet Georgia Brown. Lucky's trumpet wailed, a silver streak against the smoky haze, making the crystal chandeliers tremble. He played with a dangerous ease, his eyes closed, his body swaying as if possessed by the very spirit of the age. Everyone watched Lucky. Eleanor watched Lucky. Her turn was next. Her stomach fluttered like a trapped hummingbird. 2 years she'd spent, singing in smoky, forgotten corners, waiting for this. Tonight, Lucky had finally given her a spot in his lineup, a single number right before his big finale. It wasn't much, but in this city, a single number could be a rocket to the stars, or a lead weight to the bottom of the Hudson. She'd chosen St. Louis Blues, a song with a melancholy heart but a resilient soul. It mirrored her own journey. Her mother, still back in Iowa, would have been scandalized. Singing in such places, Eleanor? With those people? But Eleanor couldn't help it. The music called to her, a siren song more potent than any sensible advice. A stagehand, smelling faintly of stale beer, gestured, "You're on, doll." Eleanor took a deep breath, her sequin dress catching the light. She walked out into the blinding glare of the single spotlight, the applause a distant roar. The band quieted, then Lucky's trumpet sang a soft, bluesy intro, liquid and sweet. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over her, grounding her. Then she opened her mouth. Her voice was not a powerhouse shout, but a velvet caress, rich and resonant, carrying a hint of prairie dust beneath its sophisticated sheen. She didn't just sing the notes, she lived them. Her eyes, usually so earnest, now held a hint of longing, a touch of pain, a spark of pure, unadulterated joy in the act of creation. The murmurs from the tables began to die down. Forks stopped clinking against plates. Heads turned. Even Lucky, usually so absorbed in his own playing, watched her, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. When the last mournful, soaring note faded, there was a beat of silence, then an explosion of sound. Applause rained down on her, mixed with whistles and shouts of brava. She curtsied, her cheeks flushed, her heart pounding a victorious rhythm. She had done it. She had truly sung. Backstage, Lucky met her, a glint in his eye. "Eleanor Vance," he said, taking her hand and squeezing it gently. "You got something special, kid, a voice that cuts through the noise. You feel that?" She nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "I feel it." "Good," he said, releasing her hand and turning back towards the stage. "Because that's what this city is all about, feeling it and making them feel it too. You're on again tomorrow night, same time." Her heart leaped. Tomorrow night, a regular spot. This was it. This was the opening she had dreamed of. The next few months were a blur of dizzying highs. Eleanor became a fixture at the Blue Note, her name whispered among the city's elite. She bought new dresses, moved into a small, sunnier apartment in Greenwich Village, and even sent a small, hopeful check home to her mother. The music was intoxicating, the crowds adoring. Lucky Thorne, her mentor and sometimes flirtatious companion, pushed her, challenged her, and always made her feel like she belonged. One crisp autumn evening, after a particularly exhilarating set, Lucky found her by the back door, watching the taxis zoom past, painting yellow streaks on the wet street.
"You look like you're dreaming with your eyes open, Ellie," he said, lighting a cigarette. "I am," confessed, pulling her fur stole tighter against the chill. "It's all so shiny, lucky, so much more than I ever imagined." He exhaled a plume of smoke. "Shiny, sure, but remember, kid, gold can tarnish and concrete can crack. This city, it takes as much as it gives." His eyes, usually so carefree, held a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. A warning? A weariness? "Don't be a pessimist," she chided playfully, though a small seed of unease was planted. "Look at the stock market. Mr. Henderson at the bank told me everyone's getting rich. Fortunes made overnight." Lucky just chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "Mr. Henderson probably tells everyone that. Look, Eleanor, just keep your feet on the ground, even when your head's in the clouds. This new era they're all growing about, it's built on champagne wishes and credit card dreams. Someone's got to pay for all that glitter eventually." Eleanor Vance brushed off his words. He was always a bit of a cynic, especially when it came to money. She understood why a little. He'd started playing trumpet in some of the roughest juke joints in New Orleans before making his way north. He'd seen the underside of life. But New York in the late 1920s felt different, invincible. She spent her days exploring. She bought new sheet music from bustling shops, lingered in art galleries admiring the audacious modernists, and sometimes on a whim, splurged on a matinee show on Broadway. The city was a feast for the senses, a symphony of ambition and beauty. She was part of it, thriving in its relentless pace. Yet sometimes, alone in her small apartment, a quiet doubt would creep in. Was this all real? Could this dazzling, exhilarating dance last forever? She'd hear whispers on the street, hushed conversations in the dressing rooms about margin calls and bear markets. But then the music would start, the neon signs would blaze, and the doubts would vanish, dissolved in the intoxicating rhythm of the night. One night, a week before Halloween, the club was packed tighter than usual. The air practically crackled with manic energy. Lucky, playing with a wild abandon she'd never witnessed, announced, "And now, our rising star, Miss Eleanor Vance." Eleanor stepped out, dressed in a daring flapper gown, feeling more confident than ever. She sang a lively, upbeat number, her voice soaring, pulling the crowd into a whirlwind of joy. The applause was deafening, electric. For a moment, she was utterly, completely happy. After her set, she was approached by a man in an expensive suit, his hair slicked back, Mr. Sterling, a known Broadway producer. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I've heard you. I've felt you. I'm producing a new musical, a big one. I think you might be just what it needs. We should talk." Eleanor's heart nearly burst. Broadway, the ultimate dream. She looked across the crowded room, past the laughing faces, past the swirling haze of smoke. She saw Lucky, leaning against the piano, watching her with a strange, unreadable expression. Was it pride? Or was it that same flicker of weariness she'd seen before? She smiled at Mr. Sterling, her eyes bright with the promise of tomorrow. "I'd love to talk, Mr. Sterling. Absolutely." The rhythm of the neon sky was calling, brighter and louder than ever before, and Eleanor Vance was ready to answer. She was certain this golden age would last forever. Next steps for you. This segment concludes the rhythms of the neon sky phase, establishing Eleanor's ambition, success, and the intoxicating atmosphere of the late 1920s, with a hint of Lucky cynicism as a foreshadowing element. Would you like to move on to part 2, When the Well Ran Dry, which would delve into the market crash and its immediate aftermath, showing how Eleanor's gilded dreams begin to clash with concrete realities?
The transition didn't happen with a roar, but with a suffocating silence. On a Tuesday in October 1929, the music in New York didn't just stop, it soured. Eleanor had been at a costume fitting for Mr. Sterling's Broadway review, draped in hand-stitched silk and ostrich feathers, when the news broke. It started as a murmur from the street, a frantic, rhythmic shouting of newsboys, and then the theater doors burst open. Mr. Sterling, usually a man of iron-pressed collars and unshakable confidence, entered the room with his tie undone, and his face the color of wet ash. "Go home, girls," he had said, his voice hollow. "The bottom has fallen out. There is no show. There is no money. There is nothing." Within 48 hours, the neon sky Eleanor had lived under turned a bruised industrial gray. The transition from the Gilded Age to the Great Depression was like a fever breaking into a deathly chill. the silence of the Blue Note. A month later, Eleanor stood outside the Blue Note. The neon sign, once a vibrant emerald beacon, was dark. One of the glass tubes had shattered, and no one had the money to fix it. The closed sign was hand-scrawled on a piece of cardboard. Inside, the atmosphere was a tomb. The smell of stale gin remained, but the laughter had evaporated. Lucky Thorne was sitting at the piano, not playing, just staring at the keys. His trumpet, once his silver sword, lay in its velvet-lined case like a corpse in a coffin. "The bank took the lease, Allie," Lucky said without looking up. His voice lacked the playful gravel of the previous year. "The owner jumped from his office window on Wall Street yesterday. He didn't want to wait for the repo men." Eleanor sat beside him, her own coat, a remnant of her short-lived success, looking frayed at the cuffs. "But the people, Lucky, they still need to hear you play. They need the music now more than ever." Lucky finally looked at her, and the weariness she had once seen in his eyes had turned into a permanent shadow. "Music is a luxury, kid. People don't buy tickets to a dream when they can't buy milk for their children. The well hasn't just run dry, the ground has turned to dust." The slow descent. The next year was a masterclass in the art of losing. First went the apartment in Greenwich Village. Eleanor moved into a cramped tenement in the Lower East Side, where the walls were thin enough to hear her neighbors weeping at night. Then went the dresses. She sold her sequin gowns to a pawn shop for pennies on the dollar, watching as the man behind the counter tossed her Broadway dreams into a bin of discarded trinkets. She walked the streets of Manhattan, but the city had changed its face. The frantic energy of ambition had been replaced by the heavy, shuffling gait of the breadline. Thousands of men in once fine wool coats stood in lines that stretched for blocks, their eyes downcast. Eleanor found work scrubbing floors at a boarding house. Her hands, once soft and expressive as she sang St. Louis blues, were now cracked and red from lye and cold water. There were no spotlights here, only the dim glow of a kerosene lamp and the relentless rhythm of the scrubbing brush. She tried to find singing gigs, but the speakeasies had turned into grim blind pigs where men drank rot gut in silence. If they wanted music, they wanted it for free, and they didn't want the blues. They were living the blues. The breaking point. In the winter of 1930, Eleanor met Lucky one last time in Central Park. The park had become a Hooverville, a sprawling shanty town of shacks made from crates, tin, and cardboard. Lucky was thinner, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut. He wasn't wearing his trumpet case anymore. "Where is it, Lucky?" Eleanor asked, her breath blooming in the freezing air. He looked at his empty hands. "I traded it for a winter coat and 3 weeks of soup for the kids in my building. A trumpet doesn't keep you warm, Ellie, and you can't eat a high C note." The loss hit Eleanor harder than the loss of her own career. To see Lucky Thorne without his brass was to see the sun without its light. It was the final proof that the era of rhythms was dead. "I'm leaving, Ellie," Lucky said. "Heading back south. Maybe there's a farm or a labor gang that needs a pair of hands. The city is a concrete trap now. It doesn't love us anymore." "I can't go back to Iowa," Eleanor whispered. "I told them I was a star. I sent them money." "They don't care about the stars anymore, kid," Lucky said, placing a cold hand on her shoulder. "They just care about the soil. If you stay here, the concrete will swallow you whole." That night, Eleanor returned to her tenement. She had 1 nickel left in her pocket. She looked at a flyer on a telephone pole, a faded advertisement for her own show from a year ago. Her face looked back at her, young, radiant, and utterly oblivious to the coming storm. She tore the flyer down and crumbled it. The hunger was a constant gnawing companion now. It wasn't just a hunger for food, but a hunger for purpose. The well of inspiration, of wealth, and of national confidence had dried up completely. The sky wasn't neon anymore. It was the color of a lead pipe. As she sat in the dark, she realized that the gilded dream had been a collective hallucination. They had all been dancing on the edge of a canyon, convinced they could fly. Now they were at the bottom, bruised and broken, realizing that the fall was real. She closed her eyes and tried to hum a tune, but the notes felt heavy. The music had been squeezed out of her by the sheer weight of the reality around her. "The concrete is cracking," I remembered Lucky saying. She looked at her scarred hands and realized that if she was going to survive, she had to stop being a singer and start being a survivor. The jazz age was over. The era of the unyielding spirit was about to begin. But first, she had to endure the drought. By 1934, the glitter of the jazz age was not just gone. It felt like a dream someone else had dreamed. The neon sky had been replaced by a sky of a different sort, a heavy, choking bronze. The Great Plains were bleeding. The wind, once a gentle traveler across the prairies, had become a marauder, lifting the very skin of the earth and carrying it eastward in black blizzards that reached all the way to the doorsteps of New York. Eleanor Vance was no longer the girl in the sequined gown. She was a woman of 28 who looked 40, her skin toughened by wind and worry, her voice lower, raspier, not from singing, but from the grit of the era. The Migration of the Soul. After Lucky left, the city became a hollow shell. Eleanor realized that to stay in the shadows of the skyscrapers was to wait for a slow death. She did something she thought she'd never do. She headed west. Not back to the safety of Iowa, which was buried under its own layer of dust, but toward the promise of the New Deal projects in the rugged interior of the country. She ended up in a labor camp near the construction of the Hoover Dam. It was a city of tents and dust, filled with people who had lost everything but their names. Here, there were no Broadway producers or velvet curtains. There was only the heat, the relentless sun, and the unyielding spirit required to wake up every morning when the world seemed to be crumbling. A new kind of stage. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the Black Canyon, Eleanor sat on a crate outside a communal kitchen. A young man, his face caked in the white dust of the construction site, pulled out a battered guitar with only 5 strings. He began to strum a jagged, weary rhythm. Someone called out, "Hey, Eleanor, you used to be a singer in the city, didn't you? Give us something." Eleanor looked at her hands, calloused from working in the camp's infirmary. She hadn't sung a note in 3 years. She felt like the well inside her was still dry. But as she looked at the faces around her, men with hollowed eyes, mothers trying to hush crying infants, workers whose backs were bent from building a future they might never see, she felt a strange new stir. She didn't sing St. Louis Blues. That was a song for a smoke-filled room in a world that no longer existed. Instead, she began to hum a melody she had heard her grandmother sing in the fields of Iowa. It was a song of the earth, of rain, and of the quiet strength of things that grow despite the odds. When she finally sang, her voice didn't float over the crowd. It anchored them. It was a voice forged in the fire of the crash and the dust of the plains. It wasn't about gilded dreams anymore. It was about the concrete reality of standing tall when the wind tries to blow you down. "The land may rise, the sky may fall," she sang, her voice gaining strength, "but the roots we plant shall outlast them all." The camp went silent. For the first time in years, Eleanor wasn't singing for fame or for a paycheck from Mr. Sterling. She was singing to keep the person next to her from giving up. Redefining the dream. In the 1920s, Eleanor had thought the American dream was a spotlight and a mountain of gold. She thought it was about rising above everyone else. But as she stood in the dust of the canyon, watching the massive walls of the dam rise, a feat of collective human will, she realized the dream had been redefined. The new American dream wasn't about the individual's flight, it was about the community's endurance. It was the unyielding spirit of people who had been stripped of their status and wealth only to find their character underneath. She began to organize Saturdays at the camp. They weren't glamorous. They were held under the stars, on the dirt, with washboards for percussion and spoons for rhythm. Eleanor became the soul of the settlement. She taught the children songs. She sang at the funerals of workers who fell, and she sang at the weddings of couples who dared to hope in the middle of a depression. She was no longer Eleanor Vance, the jazz star. She was Eleanor, the voice of the dust, the horizon. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Lucky. It had traveled through 4 states and 3 Hoovervilles to find her. "Ellie," it read, "I'm in California now, picking peaches. It's hard work and the pay is a joke, but I found an old cornet in a junk shop for $2. I play it for the pickers at night. It doesn't sound like the Blue Note, but it sounds like the truth. I hope you're still singing. Don't let the dust get in your throat." Eleanor smiled, tucking the letter into her apron. She looked up at the neon sky, not the man-made neon of New York, but the vast, burning orange of a desert sunset. The Great Depression hadn't ended yet. The hardships were still many, and the road ahead was long. But as she stood there, covered in the fine silt of the canyon, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had lost her status, her money, and her old identity, but she had found a version of herself that was unbreakable. The liberty flame from the old stories hadn't died. It had just moved from the streets of Boston to the hearts of the common folk in the dust. Eleanor Vance took a deep breath of the dry evening air, stepped onto the makeshift stage of a wooden pallet, and began to sing. The rhythm was no longer the frantic beat of a ticker tape machine. It was the steady, pulsing heartbeat of a nation that refused to break. The well was no longer dry. It was being filled, drop by drop, with the resilience of the unyielding.